I'll introduce myself first. My name is Hunter Hickman. I am a ninth grade English teacher up in Northwest Indiana, small school district called Rensselaer Central. Um, I've been helping lead kind of our district through sort of this AI world here the last couple of years, and been doing a lot of research and work with it in my own classroom. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about, I think, some misconceptions regarding AI and how it can be a really resourceful and useful feedback tool and thinking partner for students, but primarily for teachers today. Um, so I want to kind of introduce a metaphor um, to kind of guide us through today. And so I kind of look at AI in the same way that I look at tofu. And it's kind of a funny comparison, I think, but tofu on its own is kind of bland and has no flavor. But when you take tofu and you blend it with different foods, or you have a purpose behind what it's supposed to sort of create or taste like, it takes on the flavor of whatever you cook with it. And this is something that when I was in college, I had a professor who made a comparison of something else kind of similar to this. And ironically enough, like, he was a vegetarian, and we had gone over to his house to have dinner one night, and he made us vegetarian tacos. And the idea of eating tofu, to me, coming from rural, uh, pig raising Northwest Indiana, um, that did not sound appetizing. But the metaphor, I think, kind of takes a life of its own and makes a lot of sense. And I think we're kind of in a similar boat when it comes to AI right now, is where I think there are a lot of preconceived notions or misconceptions in regards to how the tool can be used effectively in the classroom, both on the student facing end and the teacher facing end. And I think if we can overcome a lot of those misconceptions, I think we can begin to see the practical use of AI in the classroom and how it can become a very effective learning tool. And so, in this comparison, the reason I make the comparison to tofu is tofu is not threatening, it's not magic, and the most important part here is it places agency squarely with the chef. So it's up to the chef to have a purpose and a plan for how he's going to use tofu in his dish in order to make it an appetizing meal for someone. And so I look at AI in the same way. AI is not threatening to us. It's not magic. It places agency squarely with the user. And one of the things that I see a lot in my classroom right now is sort of a misplacement with that agency. I see a lot of people assume that AI is the end all be all, and kids over relying on it. And those are some of the things I'm going to break down today in this presentation, is give you some strategies as a teacher to sort of build your literacy or your expertise within this domain, uh, create that sense of agency within your AI use to where you can then provide that same expertise and knowledge for your students so they can use it in the most effective manner possible. Um, so there's some research that was done back in 2009 by a man named John Hattie. He did a meta-analysis on achievement, and actually in 2023 came out with a sequel for that. And one of the things that I found really interesting in this research is technology is not inherently high or low impact, but rather technology that replicates low impact practices stays low impact. Technology that extends high impact practices like feedback, deliberate practice, formative assessment, it amplifies results. And this kind of reminded me of a conversation kind of happening in online circles regarding AI use in schools. And one of the dilemmas that's kind of at stake is, should we go back to like paper and pencil notes, or should we continue to use technology? Because there's people that are making the claim based on some research that was done, I want to say about 10 years ago. I could be wrong on the date, but that students comprehend material better when they take paper notes, and therefore creating this narrative that technology, screen time, along with now the rise in AI use is actually diminishing our cognitive abilities in the classroom. And I want to kind of reframe that idea. Um, I think there is maybe some truth in that, depending on the context and the scenario. But I think a lot of it has to do with what um, our framework is for thinking about how technology fits in the classroom. I think a lot of people have used technology to create um, opportunities to cognitively offload less or lower hierarchy tasks. But I also think that if we can redefine what that purpose for using technology is in our classes, we can actually amplify the outcomes that we're seeing with our students. And so I want to invite you when we're going through this to kind of be open-minded about this and think about student learning outcomes and how we can use technology to extend high impact practices rather than just using technology for the sake of using technology. One of the other things is Hattie also says that the biggest lever in teaching isn't what teachers do, it's how they think about their impact. And so one of the things that I've really tried to do in my classroom that I'll speak on a little more in depth in a little bit is really actively seeking why I'm using the technology in the classroom, how I'm using it, and then most importantly, is it working, and what is measuring that success or that growth. Sometimes it's going to be performance on an assignment. Sometimes it's something different, and I think it's important to sort of define what that success looks like, but also prior to using that tool, have an idea of what that purpose is going to be. And I think if we start to look at what our impact is or how we can impact a student in their learning and how technology can advance that or extend it, then I think we're in the right frame of thinking. I think sometimes we conflate technology with a substitute for teaching rather than an extension of our teaching. And so that's another thing that as we go through this today, I want you to really try to frame it as this should always be an extension of thought if used properly, not a replacement for thought. And so today what we're going to talk about is how AI can be a collaborative partner. So what that actually means, a lot of people will cite that AI as a teacher's assistant. And I want to challenge you to think of it not as an assistant today. And I'll explain why in a minute. It is not a search engine. That's probably the biggest misconception I see among students, especially, is that they use LLMs like ChatGPT or Claude or Gemini, whatever it may be, as a glorified Google search. And it's very different from that. But most importantly, it's not a replacement for expertise. So collaboration actually requires two parties who are both thinking at the same time. And so one of the things that we can do with AI is look at it in a more Socratic way where we are constantly evaluating, constantly interrogating, and deciding, what is good information, what is bad information, but then also lead us to other perspectives, right? If our kids are constantly evaluating AI, they're thinking critically about everything they read. That's taking them beyond basic comprehension of text and actually applying the knowledge they gain from that text to real world context where they have to decide, is this useful? Is it not? How would I maybe change this information? What questions do I have due to what's being said in a text? And that's something that I think in a traditional sense, we've maybe gone away from, or one of the things that I see with like students coming into my classroom that they really struggle with. They are sort of like trained to summarize text, but they really struggle to go in depth with analyzing text. And so if we can use AI in a more of a collaborative way, we can really begin to hone in on those important analytical skills that maybe they're lacking right now. And so the framework I want you to think about is what I call the AI sandwich framework. This is not something I made up. This is something that I think gets talked about a lot in sort of various AI circles. But essentially the process of this is the human has to come up with the first purpose or idea. They're then using AI to extend that thinking, and then they're going to be the one that evaluates both their initial purpose and the AI's work to create an end product. And so that's the entire framework we're going to deal with today is creating this AI sandwich in everything that we do when we're using AI. And if we're not following this framework, we're probably offloading tasks that create cognitive atrophy. And that's maybe the single biggest concern I see facing schools, educators, and students going forward, is that we're delegating a lot of tasks and not thinking through those problems, especially in times where we feel resistance, in which it's almost it's paramount for us to be thinking through those problems. And so this is the framework we're going to use going forward for the rest of the presentation. So this is kind of the introduction to, offloading and frictional thought. I call it speed versus intelligence. And so this is something that I'm going to go through on the next slide, what I did with my class, but I introduced this idea to my students, and I think it really resonated with them. And they saw some of the larger systemic issues with, I would say, education as a whole and some of the constraints that we see. And so this idea, I know it's, I think it's been sort of brewing for a long time. This issue of speed versus intelligence. This is not a new concept where AI has now brought about this new problem. The speed problem is the just Google it culture, right? Where as teachers, student asks a question and maybe we'd say, you know what, just go Google that, right? And by going and Googling things, we're getting quick information. And so we're able to memorize facts in a short amount of time, but we're not understanding things at the conceptual level. And so our just Google it culture creates cognitive offloading, where when we want to get something just checked off our list, we just Google it real quick and we fact check. And so, like I said, this has been a problem that has originated long before large language models became accessible to the general public. Whereas intelligence, it requires understanding. And what I tell my students, it requires frictional thought. So just like when we go to the weight room and we want to become stronger, we have to resistance train and we have to break down those muscles so that they can repair and become better and stronger after the fact. Our brain is the same way. So when we feel that resistance, when we cognitively offload, we are rejecting the idea of that resistance, and then we're not seeing the growth after that. And so for us to build that intelligence and build that understanding, we have to go through the uncomfortable process of wrestling with concepts or struggling through hard problems. And so I did an activity with my class a couple weeks ago, actually, where we split the class into groups of 2 or 3 students, and students numbered themselves 1 to 3, and there was 2 rounds. In the first round, they each had a minute to talk, and they had to choose one of 3 topics. So in round 1, they could choose the rules of baseball, American history, or types of fast food in America. So things that it would be very easy for them to just elaborate on for 1 minute and have some context behind it because of our culture, because of their experiences, whatever it may be. And so that one was really easy for them. And they got up, they talked. Round 2, they had to choose one of 3 other topics: the rules of cricket, how a touchscreen actually works, and food from Spain, things that they're not going to be as familiar with or don't have a technical enough understanding of to understand what's actually happening. And so they went through that process. We identified, okay, which round was more difficult? And they, unanimously, it was always, oh, round 2 was much more difficult. Okay. So then what I had them do was take 2 minutes right now, and I want you to research the topic you chose as quickly as possible. Memorize as many facts as you can just with a simple Google search. So they did that. And then after that, we went into a lesson and we took a break from it. And about 20 minutes later, we came back full circle from our lesson to this point. And I asked students, what do you remember from your research? And pretty consistently, about half the class period didn't remember anything of what they read. They could not remember them. The other half of the students, they'd raise their hand and they'd list off, one fact like, well, cricket, each team has 11 players. And so I would always ask a follow-up question to that. And I would say, okay, what are some of the positions of a cricket team? And I never got an answer to that. There was another one where, they would say there was some, they would mention different spices and whatnot that were used in Spain. And I would say, okay, can you name 3 dishes that are popular with those spices from Spain? And then they didn't know the answer to that. And so what that showed to them was you might be able to recognize something, you might know a fact, but it doesn't mean you understand it, right? You might see a picture or a video of someone playing cricket, but it doesn't mean you understand that concept at a deeper level. And so our research is the same way. When someone says they did their research and it was just a Google search research, they may not understand that topic at a deep level, but rather we have to go and we have to find that resistance and find that friction. And when we find those elements of, hey, this made me ask a question. Hey, I never thought of it this way. That's when we've got to stop ourselves and think through the problem, right? And think through what are the possible scenarios uh, based on this, this frictional thought I'm experiencing. What are essentially what we're doing is we're training ourselves now to critically think and wrestling with these different thoughts. And so this was a really good activity for my class. And I think they really understood like what the goal of this is going forward. It's not to just memorize things as fast as possible. It's to understand the process of learning and sort of become comfortable being a little bit uncomfortable finding things that they don't know. Okay. So that's kind of the basis behind, how we use AI in the classroom. And so what this shows is that AI is not a shortcut around expertise. If we just go and we do a glorified Google search on ChatGPT, we still don't have expertise. We didn't learn anything. We just checked a box and got a task off of our list. But if we bring expertise into the loop, or into the workflow, it becomes an amplifier of that expertise because we're able to get things done faster. And we're able to curate things at a much more augmented pace where I'm not slowing down the production of my thoughts, right? So when I'm creating a document of some sort, my thoughts and the creation of that document are happening more in line with each other. And so when we say it's not a shortcut, yes, students can use it as a shortcut, but at the end of the day, it's only hurting their level of expertise and they're not learning anything. Um, One of the things that I see a lot too that kind of drives me crazy is when I hear people say things like, it can't give you the end product. It can. That's the problem with it, right? Is that it can generate end products. The problem is kids aren't gaining expertise when the only thing we care about is the end product. And so I'll talk more about that in a little bit and how you can kind of overcome um, end product issues like that. But understand that again, I don't view AI as a shortcut around learning. I view it as an amplifier of learning if we know how to use it properly. So how does it apply to the classroom? So for a classroom teacher, you can unit design stress tests. So you can draft, again, we're thinking in the lines of that AI sandwich, right? Human, AI, human loops. So we can create a unit sequence and then stress test that by trying to have the AI identify gaps in our scaffolding, where good formative checkpoints would be. And then once we get some suggestions from the AI, again, you're still the expert. You don't work for the AI. The AI is working as your partner to give you ideas for you to evaluate further. And so once you get those suggestions, there might be some constraints in which those suggestions don't work, or you don't like that for your classroom, or there's another reason or motive why you can't do that. Then you can just reiterate in the context window of that chatbot and iterate further instruction. And if you do that, you're steering the AI more in the direction that you want to go. And so again, it's a collaborator. It's not an answer for your questions. Okay. So again, stress testing, I think, is a really, really good skill to have and to build. That does not require you to cognitively offload, but rather you can use the AI to validate some of the things that you're doing in class, doing things in your units, but then also give you ideas for you to evaluate further. Next one is differentiation brainstorming. So giving your AI a learning objective and your understanding of 2 to 3 different student profiles. Like we always say, you don't want to put actual student work in the AI because of student data concerns, but describe some of those different student profiles, your archetypes, if you will, and then ask it to generate some different ideas or entry points in order to differentiate your assignments or your curriculum. And then again, at the very end, evaluate those different suggestions. And then lastly is assessment design. Give a learning target or objective, ask it to generate, sometimes being specific, like give me 3 to 5 different assessment items at various different levels. Maybe you explain some of those profiles. If I have some students who are at a 7th grade reading level and some who are at an 11th grade reading level, differentiate based on those cognitive levels. And then again, you evaluate, you iterate, you add additional context when needed. You're having a conversation with the AI throughout the entire process. So you're staying in dialogue with the AI rather than creating a monologue where you give a suggestion and the AI tells you what to do. So some evidence of kind of how it works in my classroom. I did some action research back in the fall where I had students complete 2 writing assessments. There's an experimental group and a control group. One of the things that I found, again, earlier, I had mentioned, we want to measure success, but those success metrics aren't always going to be performance based. So there's an idea or a purpose for why we're doing this. And the purpose of this was to find out how could AI, or to what extent could AI help student performance within the writing process, because that tends to be one of the, I think, the larger concerns regarding AI use is if students can write a paper with AI, then how are we ever going to discern between what a student did, what they didn't do? They're never going to write again, yada, yada, yada. And so what was found on this was the students use Khanmigo Writing Coach. And so I had access to all of their writing in real time. Students with access to AI averaged about 24 total feedback cycles per writing assessment, which was nearly 30 times more than students without access to AI. And that included both feedback with the AI itself, but also feedback with myself, the teacher. What was probably the most, I would say it was ironic and counterintuitive, but probably the most promising statistic in that was students who had access to AI actually asked twice as many questions to me than students who did not have access to AI. So because that feedback loop, which I'll go through in a minute, is kind of altered, what happened was the student would give an idea, they would get feedback from the AI, they would practice a little bit, they would ask further instruction from me based on the feedback they were already getting. So it was driving more questions, and those questions were actually of higher order. So it was more questions about thesis statements, citing evidence, building their analysis, things like that, versus I feel like in the traditional sense, when prior to using AI, it was a lot of how do you spell this, and how do I double space my paper? Like that was kind of the limit of the questioning. And so the teacher's role in all of this sort of shifted from more of an instructor and a feedback provider than I now became more of a coach. So I was actually, because I was able to see like their progress in real time, I would go around the room with my computer and I would find things to fix within the process. And so students are getting a lot more feedback in the writing process today than prior to AI being introduced into the classroom, which I think is a really important shift. The other thing that's not on here that was really interesting was students who had AI access did not score higher in performance than students who did not have access. And that's an important part too, because what it shows is the way in which students or improve their writing is going to be through good writing instruction, not because of the AI, right? And it goes back to the original thesis of the only way that we uh, build writing skills is through expertise, and we have to extend that expertise, which we can do that more effectively with AI, and we can have more informed curriculum and more informed instruction, but it can't fix it itself. It's not the problem solver. It's not the replacement for the work and the cognitive thought that is necessary to build those abilities. And so this is kind of what the feedback loop shifted from. Again, this is the human AI, the AI sandwich. So the traditional, what I call the sequestered feedback cycle, where students would be given an assignment, they would typically spend it in isolation, writing on their own, not asking a lot of questions, not socializing with peers. If there is socialization with peers, maybe there's some peer feedback reviews, but the problem with that is students who are 14 and 15, they don't have the writing expertise to provide good sound feedback. So it puts a lot more pressure on the teacher who's taking a lot of time. It's taking a long time to get that feedback back, and then students probably aren't even looking at it, right? Whereas now, the collaborative feedback cycle is I teach, students go and practice these skills before they ever get introduced to AI. They then get AI feedback on some of those skills. They evaluate those skills, they revise them, they get teacher insights, and then they grow. And then we repeat that cycle over and over. So, like, imagine that cycle happening 24 to 25 times during one writing assignment, which is what happened in the action research, versus that traditional feedback cycle is typically one cycle. And that was also shown in the action research. Okay. And so students are getting much more engagement and much more thoughtful feedback throughout the process than they ever have prior to, again, the introduction of AI in the classroom. And so for students, what this means is I think there's some strategies in which they have to develop, and I think this is very product agnostic. I think that no matter what tool you use, I think these are really good habits for them to build to where they're not just asking the AI to do this for them or to just show them how to do this. Even just saying, show me how to do this, they're not learning to understand it. They're just trying to essentially copy down what the process of something is. And so Socratic prompting, where students are interrogating and asking difficult questions to the AI to make it reason with them, is a really good strategy. And I would encourage your students to explore that. And I would encourage you as a teacher to explore how to Socratically prompt engineer within an AI or an LLM or an AI tool. Next thing is to ask the AI to explain it in different ways, right? The way that we can iterate the AI and use what's called steerability, which is basically we control where the AI goes and understanding how to add that context, how to drive the questioning or the outputs in a certain direction can help our students better understand a concept. And so right now, my students are using a lot of Notebook LM. And that's one of the things that we've talked a lot about is when you go to create a podcast, you need to steer the AI in a certain direction because it's at the end of the day, you're responsible for the expertise. And so if you need something, you need to direct it in that way to get the outputs that you need to be able to evaluate it in the most optimal way possible. And so when you're doing that, you're constantly thinking about what I could be asking, what the AI is saying, what I should be thinking next. And because you're constantly evaluating, you're constantly creating that learning friction or that learning resistance. And now you're not offloading, you're actually thinking critically. And you're doing it in a much more than you probably were prior to having these tools at your disposal. And so that's why I say I think a lot of times if we use this properly, it can be an extension of expertise or an extension of critical thought rather than just a tool to replace one's work. The last is just to debate the AI. A fun thing to do with your class is have them try and break it, right? You have a tool in there, like get them to find a way to get the AI to give them something that the AI, you know, shouldn't. And I mean that in the most like obviously academic and appropriate way, right? Like if you're using Magic School or Conmigo or School AI, like have them really try to debate it and um, have them tell them to instruct the AI if they're using an LLM to take the opposite stance of this and make me think critically about it. Ask me questions that challenge my train of thought and make me reason with it. And so we can kind of create the environment and the external variables within these conversations if we learn the concept of steerability, if we learn the concept of prompt engineering in a very Socratic way. A few additional notes to this. The stakes around cognitive development for students are much higher because they don't have the same capacity for discernment as an adult who understands the value of cognitive thought. As a teacher, as someone who's gone to school prior to the AI era, you have a level of expertise that's kind of built in. The fear is kids won't have that expertise anymore because they will become over reliant on the AI. And so we have to keep that in mind that when we are teaching these skills or we're letting kids use these tools, that we need to have the ability to teach them how to use it properly. And so that requires teachers, I think, to go out and learn how to prompt engineer, how to use these in the most Socratic way possible, how to steer the AI in a certain direction. Because if we don't, and our students are using these tools and they ask us for help and we don't really know how to do these things, I think it could be very detrimental to their growth and ultimately their performance going forward. And so it's really critical that teachers begin, even in their own time, they building some of these skills, playing with these tools to understand how they work properly to provide for your students in the best way possible. A key distinction that I think you can also bring up with your students is when they're using these tools, have them ask themselves or even ask yourself when you're using them, who is doing the generative thinking? Who is generating the thoughts? Who is generating the loops within this conversation? And if it's not us, then we're offloading and we're doing something wrong. And so it's a really good way to sort of audit our processes when using LLMs. But just in the back of your mind, always be asking yourself, who is doing the generative thinking? Who's generating the situation or the conversation within this context window? So here's a little chart to put together to kind of give you some ideas of how you can use AI probably in the most practical way, given whatever your subject is. Like I said earlier, I'm an ELA teacher, so we use it a lot for critical thinking, for writing, and writing feedback. That's probably the primary way in which we use it. We've been using a lot of Notebook LM lately for research and helping kids sort of augment that process. And instead of them spending time blindly looking through Google for sources, they're finding their sources quickly and then spending more time evaluating sources. And so my thought process with that was to take a step back and ask myself, where does the learning actually happen? It's in the evaluation process, right? It's not in the doom scrolling Google trying to find a source or doom scrolling Google Scholar trying to find sources. That's not allowing them to think through these problems. And so I wanted them to spend as much time as possible evaluating, assessing, and interrogating these sources. That way they're constantly thinking about them versus constantly trying to just find answers to things, if that makes sense. But I think it fits differently in every class. I think in a math context, it's really difficult in math, I think, because the natural instinct is to say, show me how to do this. but it needs to be more conversational than that. It needs to be a way, prompted in a way that diagnoses where in their process they're making mistakes. And so it needs to, I think that's where something like Notebook LM could come through as well, is if a student can put resources in the notebook, prompt it by asking it or telling it what it's struggling with, and create some videos or create some reports that break down step by step, and give a little bit more explanation than just here's how you do it and this is what it looks like when you show your work. I think that can be a much more effective way to use it as well. But nonetheless, I think someone asked in there, can we have this shared? At the very end, I have a QR code that takes you to a little site, and you'll be able to have those slides there too. It's on that site for you. So you guys can come back and look at this whenever you want, or you can screenshot it right now if you want to or whatever. But you'll have access to this when we're done. So, all right. So kind of give a little bit more background on this. So what are some of the conditions that make this partnership work, this AI sandwich? One, you've got to bring your knowledge first. So expertise is paramount to make this whole partnership work. If there is no expertise there, if there is no purpose, it's going to hallucinate. It's going to make mistakes. You're going to have a generation where offloading is the most important thing, which we know is going to diminish our ability to think critically. And so we have to have the knowledge base first to be able to use this tool in the most optimal way possible. Number two, I mentioned it a little bit earlier, but stay in dialogue, not monologue, meaning you are collaborating. The two of you have to be thinking at the same time. If it becomes monologue, where really the only way that happens is if you give it a prompt and then you're just listening to it, to the AI, and taking whatever it says as law, then that becomes problematic as well. Number three, keep your judgment in the driver's seat. The thing I tell the kids all the time is the AI works for you. You don't work for the AI. So you don't have to listen to the feedback it gives you. You need to evaluate that first and decide for yourself, is this credible or is it not? And then ask yourself why. And if you can reflect upon that every time you use it, you're at least using conscious decision making to decide whether or not this is good information for you to use, and you can stand behind that work. Now we can actually teach the kid, well, this didn't work and this is why your process was wrong, and this is how it can become better, versus just saying you were wrong. And there's no coaching point there if we just offload that information. So make sure that you and your students are both keeping your judgment at the driver's seat. And then lastly, identify what that purpose is before you start. If you don't know why you're using an LLM, you don't know why your students are using AI, then you probably shouldn't be using it, right? And that goes back to that whole low impact, teaching, or low impact technology results in low impact or objectives, or I'm sorry, objectives, but low impact results, right? High impact teaching, high impact technology results in high impact results. And so essentially what I say is, if you put garbage into the AI, you're going to get garbage out of it. And so you have to have that purpose. You have to have that context, that knowledge. And the more you have of that, it becomes a very good extender of that expertise. And it can become kind of a superpower for you, I think, as a teacher, make you more effective, streamline your processes, and allow you to provide better for your students. So a couple of things that get in the way. Some of these are probably pretty obvious, but one is just fear, right? A lot of teachers, this has become very disruptive in our world. Like, everyone is kind of adopting this. A lot of people are adopting it just for the sake of adopting it. And so then when it hallucinates or it makes mistakes because we're using it without having a good understanding or grasp of what it is, people become more resistant to it. And so I call those people the rejectionists. And so when we become rejectionists, we don't help our students, but we just become less capable of helping guide them through all these problems. Because you and I both know students are using this at like an 85 to 90% plus rate. So if they're using it and we aren't comfortable with it and we can't guide them through it properly, then I think we're letting them down a little bit. And so I think we have to at least be versed in it to where we can make this as positive of a thing as possible and teach them how to protect their thinking while they use them. The second thing is over reliance. This is one that I see a lot too, is that um, teachers, professionals are using this for everything. You guys probably know this, but I can't tell you how many flyers I see on Facebook that are chat GPT, and it drives me absolutely crazy. It's like a total turn off right away, right? That you put in very little effort to create that. And I'm all about like using those things to augment, but it's the same looking flyer all the time. Um, a lot of times people make mistakes when they're using ChatGPT for documentation or whatever because they're not proofreading it. And when those things happen, again, it's a turnoff, right? It makes you look lazy. And so we can't over rely on it. We have to be in that cycle. And so that's why that sandwich is really important is we have the purpose and the intent. We give it the context. The AI does its thing fast, but then we've got to be the one that is responsible for the end product as well. And so that's one thing that gets in the way as well. And then lastly, is we're just asking the wrong question. So ask not what AI can do for you, but instead, what do I want to accomplish and how might AI help me think through it better? And if you can answer that question, using AI to help solve that problem is a good solution. If you can't answer that question, it's probably not something that you should use it for. So a couple things before we kind of wrap up, and I'll open up for some questions. And if you want to start, if you have questions that are on your mind, you want to start popping them in the Q&A here right now, feel free to. And then once I get to the very end here, I'll start rattling through them and I'll answer your questions as best as possible. But just one thing that we can kind of keep in the back of our mind is when AI replaces thinking, learning decreases. That's offloading. When AI supports reflection, learning increases. And so the key there again is, I think I've said it multiple times, but reflection, evaluation, those things where we're constantly interrogating the AI is what's going to help our students learn probably at a more productive rate than what they have prior. If we're going to stick to this whole just Google it culture and offload a lot of these tasks, then it's not going to happen. I'll tell a funny story real quick too. I made a notebook LM for my students for research and citations. And so I put all the pages from Purdue OWL into a notebook LM to where my students, all they have to do is say, how do I cite a book in MLA format? And so it doesn't give them the answer. It just cites the exact example from Purdue OWL. So they still have to look at it and apply the example to their own paper. But it's a really quick process. Like it takes 10 seconds to do it. I had a student who at one point when we had a class debate was kind of anti-AI because it would hurt their thinking or diminish their thinking. Came up to me and asked me after I'd shown them the notebook LM if he could use a citation generator instead, which like just highlighted the entire problem with this, right? Is that no, like that doesn't make you think at all. That's just offloading it to a piece of technology. It's not allowing you to actually go through and learn what is needed in a citation or a works cited entry. And so I had told him no and explained to him why. And I think he understood, but that highlights like the larger systemic problem that we have in schools is that there's a lot of tasks that we do in our everyday classrooms that just with Google that would be considered offloading. And that's nothing to do with AI. But it kind of gets lumped in with now that AI use has become much more prevalent, it's become more of an AI issue now instead of more of a systemic issue. So a couple of suggestions of overcoming this. Don't ban AI in your classes or in your schools, but rather just make the learning more visible. What can you do to make kids stand behind their own work? Maybe it's after they write a paper, you ask them a follow-up question, and that'll become pretty clear whether or not they understand the topic. Maybe you ask them to explain their process, explain their thinking, lots of reflection pieces, things like that to show where they were at, what they were thinking when they completed your assignment. The second thing is make the process the graded product, not the end product. If you're going to create a process where the end product is what is earning the A or the B or the C or whatever, then you're rewarding the thing that can be best created using AI. Like content is AI's strength, not process. And so if we want kids to think and we want kids to use their critical thinking skills, reward the process. So one of the things that I do with writing assignments in my classroom is, um, if they go through the process, they ask questions, they try to incorporate, um, what they're being coached on in the classroom, then they earn an A. But then I give a performance score where I break down like where they struggled, what they did well, what they didn't do well, so they have feedback going forward. And I have a lot less issues with cheating in my class since I've gone to that, because I'm not rewarding the end product. They don't feel the temptation to go and complete an assignment that's not theirs to boost their grade. And so over a period of time, they're going to build more skills, spend more time thinking, spend more time working, which is going to improve their writing abilities. And then lastly, keep trying to create what I call manufactured diversity, create situations where they have to think, where they have to reflect, where they have to evaluate. And the more you do this, the more comfortable they become with that frictional thought process that I mentioned earlier. Little note here, okay, if there are any administrators on here or instructional coaches, you're going to get resistance from your staff on this, okay? Don't look at those as, pushback, or look at it as something you have to overcome, but rather look at that as a source of new information and new ideas, and include those people in your process for how you implement and how you adopt AI in your schools, because that's a sign of a healthy culture. If people are not afraid to resist and are not afraid to question and interrogate each other on these important issues, then we become a very compliant school, and that's not always the best system for initiatives. And so if you do have that resistance, like embrace that, hear those people out, and try to educate them, but also let them educate you on what's happening in the classroom that might be a constraint that needs to be considered going forward. So final point, and this is where I think, to wrap this all up, why it's so important for teachers is, Hattie also identifies what he calls the flat learning curve, which is after 2 or 3 years, most teachers will plateau, just because they become more comfortable in their role. But at that 2 or 3 year mark, we lack a lot of collaboration, and that's not a knock on you as a teacher or your department. It's a systemic issue within the structure of education, is that we don't have access on an everyday basis to expert feedback, research, collaboration. Every conference I go to, one of the big concerns that people will mention is we just don't have time for development on this. How do we professionally develop our staff on this technology in a very efficient and effective way? And that's one of the biggest hurdles we have to overcome. AI allows us to overcome that in some capacity, right? And so the best teachers have been overcoming these things, but have to kind of go out of their way to do it, whether it's networking groups, going and educating themselves, attending conferences. Now you have access to that 24/7 at your fingertips, right? You can upload information, evaluate it, have something, to bounce ideas off of, validate, push back against you, find gaps in your lessons and in your curriculums that you haven't had prior. And so students have always needed someone to sort of be that resistance to them. And that's always been you, right? You, the teacher, you're the one that's always been challenging them, but you haven't been getting challenged yourself, maybe on as regular of a basis as you feel like you need to or you want to. Now you have that ability. So using AI as your thinking partner, I think can take your teaching to the next level, uh, which again, at the end of the day, the end goal of this is to provide more for our students. And I think if we can sort of reframe our thought process and our viewpoints of what AI is, and what it can be in the classroom, like I said at the very beginning, I think this doesn't become a replacement for expertise, but rather I think it amplifies the expertise and the abilities that we have in the classroom. So, in conclusion, AI is not going to solve this on its own, right? It's going to take you implementing systems and workflows into what you do every day to become proficient in these skills, to ask difficult questions, to consistently, stress test, interrogate, evaluate, analyze the things that you're doing, have difficult conversations, and create a more conducive learning environment in a post AI world. I think if we do that again, you can become the source of growth and make AI a more positive thing in our classrooms where kids are encouraged to learn, experiment, and attempt difficult things, maybe more so now than ever before. And so, by no means do I think that AI is the end all be all. I don't think I'm a cheerleader of AI, but I do think that it's here and it's not going away. And if we don't find a way to adapt to it and make it something positive, and put systems in place to where students again are encouraged and incentivized to think and struggle, then I think we're going to be in trouble. But I think if we can put those systems in and reevaluate what we're doing, then I think that it can become a very, very positive thing. So, in that QR code, it's a little portfolio side of mine. It has my contact info, has this presentation along with some others. If there's ever a time that I can help you, please feel free to reach out. I'm always happy to help. I'm also active on LinkedIn, so feel free to connect there, reach out there, and I'd be happy to help you there. I've done some PDs and stuff before too, whether it be with departments or staff. So if there's any way that I can help you in that capacity as well, please feel free to reach out, and I'd be happy to do that. But if there's any questions, I'll open up now, and you can pop a question in the Q&A, and I'll try and answer it as best as I can.